The courtroom fell silent as Judge William Hargrove collapsed into his chair, career destroyed by his own prejudice. 2 weeks earlier, he had ordered decorated black veteran Marcus Washington to remove his Distinguished Service Cross before testifying. That moment of disrespect ignited a firestorm nobody saw coming. Before I reveal how this explosive confrontation began, tell me where you're watching from in the comments. Hit that like button if you believe respect should be given to those who've served our country, and subscribe to hear more stories about justice prevailing against discrimination. Now, let's go back to see how Marcus Washington's quiet dignity set off a chain reaction that would change American courtrooms forever. Marcus Washington never considered himself a hero, despite the Distinguished Service Cross that occasionally adorned his chest on special occasions. At 72 years old, the Georgia native carried himself with the same quiet dignity he had maintained throughout his life, even when faced with the constant sting of racial prejudice that had followed him from his childhood in segregated Oakwood to the jungles of Vietnam and back home again. Born to hardworking parents who had instilled in him values of integrity, perseverance, and respect, Marcus had enlisted in the Army in 1968, not out of patriotic fervor, but out of a deep-seated belief that service might finally earn him the respect that his skin color had thus far denied him in his hometown. Basic training had quickly disabused him of that notion. As white drill sergeants singled him out for additional punishment, fellow recruits refused to bunk near him, and officers overlooked his exceptional marksmanship scores when selecting for specialized training. Despite this, Marcus excelled, driven by an internal standard of excellence that transcended the racism surrounding him. His unit deployment to Vietnam in early 1969 thrust him into the crucible of combat, where bullets and explosions proved colorblind in their destruction. It was during a vicious firefight near the Cambodian border that Marcus demonstrated the extraordinary courage that would earn him one of the nation's highest military honors. When his platoon was ambushed and his commanding officer severely wounded, Marcus had taken command, organized a defensive position, and then, with complete disregard for his own safety, crossed open ground under heavy fire to drag 3 wounded comrades to safety. Not satisfied with this, he had then single-handedly flanked the enemy position, taking out a machine gun nest that had pinned down the remainder of his unit, allowing for a successful evacuation of the wounded. The official citation noted his extraordinary heroism, but what it failed to mention was how, upon returning to base, the white officer whose life he had saved refused to shake his hand, and how the subsequent award ceremony had been held with minimal attendance and recognition, a far cry from the celebrations afforded to white soldiers receiving similar honors. Upon returning home in 1971, Marcus found that his Distinguished Service Cross opened few doors in a South still struggling with integration. He took a job at the local paper mill, married his high school sweetheart Elaine, who had waited faithfully for his return, and quietly built a life for himself in the same community that continued to view him as a second-class citizen. Over the decades, as civil rights legislation slowly changed the legal landscape, Marcus worked his way up to floor supervisor at the mill, raised 2 children who both graduated college, a first in his family, and eventually retired with the respect of those who worked alongside him, if not the broader community. His son Michael became an engineer in Atlanta, while his daughter Patricia chose to stay closer to home, working as a nurse at the local hospital and marrying James, giving Marcus and Elaine their pride and joy, grandson Andre. Now, in his retirement years, Marcus had become a fixture in Oakwood's black community, serving as a deacon at First Baptist Church, volunteering at the Veterans Center on Wednesdays, and mentoring young men who, like his grandson Andre, were considering military service despite the country's complicated relationship with black servicemen. The pocket watch that Marcus carried everywhere had been given to him by his father the day he deployed, a family heirloom that had once belonged to his grandfather, a Buffalo soldier who had served with distinction despite facing even more overt racism than Marcus had experienced. The watch, with its worn silver case and slightly yellowed face, served as a physical reminder of his family's legacy of service and dignity in the face of oppression. The Distinguished Service Cross, however, Marcus wore only on special occasions, Veterans Day ceremonies, Memorial Day services, and yes, court appearances. He believed that the medal represented not just his individual bravery, but the collective sacrifice of all black soldiers who had fought for a country that often refused to fight for them. The night before he was due to appear in court to testify about a car accident he had witnessed involving his neighbor's son, Jamal, a promising high school basketball player accused of recklessly causing a collision with a white businessman's expensive sports car, Marcus had carefully polished the bronze cross and attached it to the left breast of his best suit jacket. He sat on the edge of his bed, fingers tracing the raised metal of the medal, remembering the weight of his injured lieutenant across his shoulders as bullets kicked up dirt around his feet. Elaine had entered quietly, placing her hand on his shoulder, understanding without words the complexity of emotions the medal always evoked in him. They had been married for 47 years, and she knew the pain and pride that coexisted in her husband's relationship with his military service. "You don't have to wear it tomorrow," she said softly, knowing that in their small town such displays often invited unwanted attention. Marcus had looked up at her, the deep lines in his face set with determination. "This isn't about me, Elaine. That boy needs someone to stand up for him, someone they might actually listen to." They both knew the reality that in a predominantly white courthouse with a white judge and likely an all-white jury, if the case proceeded, Jamal needed every advantage possible. Marcus hoped that perhaps the medal might lend his testimony additional credibility, might make the white faces in that courtroom see beyond his skin color to the man who had been willing to die for the same country that now threatened to railroad a young black man for an accident that wasn't his fault. As he finally turned out the light that night, Marcus whispered a prayer for strength, not knowing that the next day would test his dignity and resolve in ways that combat never had, or that his quiet stand in a small-town Georgia courtroom would ignite a firestorm that would eventually reach the highest levels of military and judicial leadership in the country. The Oakwood County Courthouse stood as an imposing reminder of Southern justice, its columned facade and polished marble steps projecting an authority that had historically served white citizens far more favorably than black ones. Marcus arrived early on the morning of May 15th, parking his meticulously maintained 2006 Buick in the public lot and taking a moment to straighten his tie and check that his Distinguished Service Cross sat properly on his lapel. The case that brought him here centered around 17-year-old Jamal Williams, the son of Marcus's neighbors and a star basketball player with scholarship prospects, who had been driving home from practice when his 10-year-old Honda collided with businessman Richard Bennington's BMW at the intersection of Oak and Main. Despite multiple witnesses stating that Bennington had run a red light while texting, the police report suspiciously favored the white businessman's account, which claimed Jamal had been speeding and driving recklessly. Marcus had been walking home from the corner store when he witnessed the entire incident, his military-trained eyes missing no detail of Bennington's distracted driving or the sequence of events that led to the crash. Bennington had filed a civil suit seeking $60,000 in damages, an amount that would financially devastate the Williams family and potentially derail Jamal's college plans. As Marcus climbed the courthouse steps, he noticed the curious glances from white courthouse employees, their eyes inevitably drawn to the medal on his chest before quickly looking away. The Williams family was already seated in the hallway outside courtroom 3, Mrs. Williams clutching her son's hand, while Mr. Williams paced nervously. "Mr. Washington," Jamal said, standing respectfully as Marcus approached. "Thank you for coming." Marcus placed a reassuring hand on the young man's shoulder, noting the fear poorly disguised beneath his attempt at stoicism. "I'm just here to tell the truth, son. That's all any of us can do." Their attorney, Thomas Reynolds, a young black lawyer from Atlanta who had taken the case pro bono after hearing about the suspicious police report, approached with a tight smile. "Mr. Washington, thank you for being here. Judge Covington is presiding today. I should warn you, he has a reputation." Marcus nodded, having heard about Richard Covington, a 64-year-old judge known for his harsh sentences for black defendants and his dismissive attitude toward black attorneys. Court records that Reynolds had researched showed that Covington sentenced black defendants to an average of 30% longer sentences than whites for identical crimes, though such statistics had never triggered judicial review. The bailiff called them into the courtroom at 9 sharp, and Marcus took a seat in the gallery behind the Williams family. Bennington was already seated at the plaintiff's table with his attorney, a silver-haired partner from the most prestigious firm in the county. Judge Covington entered, his robes flowing around his substantial frame, his florid face set in a perpetual expression of irritation. Everyone rose as required, but Marcus noted the judge's cursory glance at the defense table, the slight curl of his lip when he saw Reynolds and the Williams family. The proceedings began with opening statements, Bennington's attorney painting Jamal as a reckless teenager with no regard for property or safety, while Reynolds calmly presented the facts of the case, emphasizing the multiple witnesses who would testify that Bennington had run the red light. Marcus watched as Covington repeatedly interrupted Reynolds, but allowed Bennington's attorney to speak unhindered. When Bennington took the stand, his testimony dripped with coded racial language, referring to Jamal as these young thugs who think they own the road, and, typical of his kind, no respect for other people's property. Reynolds objected to the characterization, but Covington overruled him with a dismissive wave. The witness is simply expressing his perception of the defendant's attitude. When it came time for Reynolds to call his first witness, he announced, "The defense calls Marcus Washington." Marcus made his way to the witness stand, aware of the eyes following him, some curious, some hostile. He was sworn in by the clerk, his deep voice clear as he promised to tell the truth. It was then that Judge Covington's gaze fixed on the Distinguished Service Cross on Marcus's chest. His eyes narrowed and he leaned forward. "Mr. Washington, what is that you're wearing?" Marcus straightened slightly. "This is the Distinguished Service Cross, Your Honor. I received it for service in Vietnam." Covington's face hardened. "Are you aware that this courtroom has rules of decorum? Medals, pins, and other decorations are not appropriate attire for court proceedings." A confused murmur ran through the courtroom. Reynolds stood immediately. "Your Honor, there is no rule prohibiting a witness from wearing a legitimately earned military decoration." Covington's gavel cracked against the bench. "I am the arbiter of appropriate conduct in my courtroom, Counselor. Mr. Washington, please remove the medal before testifying." The courtroom fell silent. Marcus sat perfectly, still, his weathered hands resting calmly on his thighs. When he spoke, his voice was respectful but firm. "Your Honor, with all due respect, this medal was awarded to me by the President of the United States for combat service to my country. I wear it to honor that service and the men who served alongside me." Covington's face flushed deeper. "Mr. Washington, perhaps you misunderstood. That wasn't a request. Remove the medal or you will not testify in my courtroom." Reynolds was on his feet again. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular and potentially prejudicial to my client's case. Mr. Washington is a key witness, and there is no legal basis for requiring him to remove a military decoration." Covington's eyes never left Marcus. "Last chance, Mr. Washington. Remove the medal or be held in contempt." Marcus felt a familiar calm settle over him, the same calm that had allowed him to move through enemy fire to save his comrades. "Your Honor, I cannot do that. This medal represents a sacred trust and honor. To remove it would dishonor the sacrifice it stands for." Covington's gavel slammed down 3 times in rapid succession. "Bailiff, remove this witness from my courtroom. He is in contempt." As the bailiff approached, visibly uncomfortable with his assignment, Reynolds frantically cited legal precedents protecting witnesses from arbitrary exclusion. Jamal's mother began to quietly weep, understanding what this meant for her son's case. The bailiff placed a hesitant hand on Marcus's shoulder. "Sir, I need you to come with me." With dignity, Marcus stood and followed the bailiff from the courtroom, his back straight, his eyes forward, just as they had been when he had marched into combat decades earlier. As he passed the gallery, he noticed a young black woman furiously scribbling notes, her press badge identifying her as Aisha Johnson from the Atlanta Tribune. Her eyes met his briefly, filled with a mixture of outrage and determination. Outside in the hallway, Marcus stood quietly as the bailiff apologized softly. "I'm sorry, sir. I served too. Army, Iraq. This isn't right." Marcus simply nodded. "You're just doing your job, son." Inside, Reynolds was arguing passionately for a continuance, but Covington denied the motion. The court will proceed without Mr. Washington's testimony. The plaintiff has presented sufficient evidence, and the defense has other witnesses. But they all knew none of the other witnesses had the credibility or clear view of the accident that Marcus had possessed. Without his testimony, Jamal's case was severely weakened. As Marcus sat on a bench in the courthouse hallway, still unwilling to leave in case the judge reversed his decision, he considered the irony that after facing enemy fire, after enduring decades of discrimination, it was his refusal to deny his service and sacrifice that might now prevent justice for a young man who reminded him so much of himself at that age. What Marcus couldn't know was that Aisha Johnson was already on her phone in the courthouse bathroom, calling her editor with a story that would explode across Georgia by nightfall and across the nation within days. Judge orders black veteran to remove Distinguished Service Cross or face contempt. The headline of the Atlanta Tribune blazed across social media platforms within hours of Aisha Johnson filing her story. The young reporter had not only detailed the courtroom confrontation with precision, but had also researched Marcus Washington's military record and included a scan of his citation for extraordinary heroism, creating a stark contrast between his service and the disrespect shown by Judge Covington. A 72-year-old veteran who risked his life repeatedly to save his fellow soldiers was humiliated today in an Oakwood County courtroom by Judge Richard Covington, who apparently found the Distinguished Service Cross, the nation's second highest military honor, too offensive for his courtroom, Johnson wrote in her opening paragraph. The article went on to quote multiple legal experts who stated that no valid judicial rule existed that would prohibit a witness from wearing legitimately earned military decorations while testifying. By evening, the story had been picked up by national news outlets, and Marcus Washington's dignified refusal had become a symbol for both military disrespect and racial prejudice in the justice system. Marcus himself was startled by the sudden attention. His phone began ringing constantly with calls from reporters, military organizations, and strangers offering support. Helene fielded the calls, protecting her husband from the media circus developing around him. Marcus has never sought attention, she told a particularly persistent reporter from CNN. He was just trying to do right by the Williams boy. Inside their modest ranch-style home, Marcus sat in his favorite armchair, watching with disbelief as his face appeared on the evening news. "I didn't want any of this," he told Elaine softly. "I just couldn't take it off. Not for him. Not like that." Elaine squeezed his shoulder. "You did the right thing. You always do." Their daughter Patricia arrived with Andre, both having seen the news. Andre, at 18, vibrated with righteous anger. "Grandpa, this is exactly why I've been saying the system is broken. A white judge thinks he can disrespect a black war hero just because he can." Marcus tried to calm his grandson. "It's not that simple, Andre." But even as he said it, Marcus knew that in many ways it was exactly that simple. The racial dynamics that had defined his life continued to shape his grandson's world, despite the progress made over decades. Meanwhile, across town, Judge Covington was blindsided by the backlash. He had expected his authority to be absolute, as it had always been in his courtroom. The first inkling that something was amiss came when his clerk nervously informed him that the courthouse had received over 300 angry phone calls by closing time. "They're saying you disrespected a war hero, Judge," the clerk explained, unable to meet Covington's eyes. "It's all over Twitter and Facebook." Covington dismissed the concerns with a wave. "Social media hysteria. It will blow over. I was simply maintaining the dignity of my courtroom." But by morning, the situation had escalated dramatically. Veterans organizations from across the political spectrum had issued statements condemning the judge's actions. The American Legion, VFW, and Iraq and Afghanistan Veterans of America all called for formal apologies and potential judicial review. Military forums and websites exploded with outrage, with active duty and retired service members pledging to attend Marcus's next court appearance in uniform as a show of solidarity. Conservative commentators who rarely addressed racial issues found common cause with civil rights advocates in denouncing the treatment of a decorated veteran. Judge Covington, issued a terse statement through the court's public information officer. Court proceedings require decorum and freedom from distraction. No special privileges can be extended based on outside affiliations or decorations. The rules apply equally to all who enter the courtroom. This response only fueled the growing outrage, as many pointed out that no such rule existed in the court's published procedures. The hastily crafted statement was widely interpreted as doubling down rather than acknowledging any error in judgment. Do you think Judge Covington was enforcing legitimate courtroom rules, or was this a clear case of racial bias? Comment number 1 if you believe he was simply maintaining courtroom decorum, or number 2 if you think this was discrimination against a black veteran. Hit that like button if you believe our veterans deserve respect regardless of their race, and subscribe to see how this explosive situation continues to unfold. As the story gained momentum, reporter Aisha Johnson dug deeper into Judge Covington's judicial record, uncovering disturbing patterns of racial disparities in his rulings and sentencing. Her follow-up piece detailed how black defendants in his courtroom received sentences averaging 32% longer than white defendants for equivalent crimes, and how he had dismissed lawsuits from black plaintiffs at nearly 3 times the rate of those filed by whites. These statistics, previously buried in court records and ignored by oversight committees, now became ammunition in the growing calls for judicial review. For the Williams family, the media attention brought mixed emotions. On one hand, their son's case had gained visibility that might help ensure a fair outcome. On the other, they worried about becoming collateral damage in a larger cultural battle. "We just want justice for Jamal," Mr. Williams told Aisha Johnson in a follow-up interview. "Mr. Washington was trying to help us, and now he's caught in this storm." Meanwhile, Marcus's grandson, Andre, had embraced activism with newfound purpose. A bright student who had been considering military service like his grandfather, Andre now organized fellow students at Oakwood High to attend the next court date in support of both his grandfather and Jamal. "This is about respect," he told his classmates during an impromptu gathering in the school parking lot. "Respect for service, respect for truth, and respect for our community." Community leaders from Oakwood's black churches and civil rights organizations began coordinating responses, arranging transportation for elderly residents who wanted to attend the rescheduled hearing, and reaching out to state and national organizations for support. What had begun as a simple car accident case had transformed into a flashpoint for issues of racial justice, military respect, and judicial accountability. National news vans lined Oakwood's main street, transforming the sleepy Georgia town into the epicenter of a national conversation. CNN, Fox News, MSNBC, and major network correspondents broadcast live updates from the courthouse steps. Veterans groups announced plans to bus in supporters from neighboring states. The county sheriff requested additional officers to manage the expected crowds, while the court administration scrambled to accommodate the unprecedented media presence. Throughout it all, Judge Covington remained defiant, refusing to recuse himself from the case despite mounting pressure. He declined all interview requests and issued no further statements, creating an information vacuum that was filled with speculation and analysis from legal experts across the political spectrum. Court officials privately urged him to address the situation more effectively, but his decades on the bench had fostered a belief in his own unquestionable authority. Marcus Washington, meanwhile, struggled with unwanted attention while remaining committed to justice for Jamal Williams. The elderly veteran received calls from war buddies he hadn't heard from in decades, men who had served alongside him in Vietnam and who promised to stand with him at the next hearing. Military organizations offered legal support and media management. Civil rights attorneys volunteered to represent him if he wished to file complaints against Judge Covington. Through it all, Marcus maintained his quiet dignity, agreeing only to a single brief statement read by Thomas Reynolds on the courthouse steps. "I wore my Distinguished Service Cross to honor the sacrifice of all who served. I will continue to stand for truth and justice, as I did during my military service." As the rescheduled court date approached, the question on everyone's mind was how Judge Covington would respond to the national spotlight now focused on his courtroom, and whether Marcus Washington would again be prevented from testifying on behalf of young Jamal Williams. What nobody anticipated was the intervention about to come from the highest levels of military justice, as news of the confrontation reached officers who understood precisely what the Distinguished Service Cross represented and who were unwilling to see it disrespected in an American courtroom. How would you feel if a judge ordered you to remove a symbol of your greatest accomplishment before allowing you to speak? Have you ever witnessed discrimination in a place where justice should be blind? The story continues as we discover how the military community responds to this affront to one of their own. Colonel James Wilson sat in his Pentagon office, staring at the news article on his computer screen, with growing indignation. At 48, the JAG officer had built a distinguished career upholding military justice, and the story of a fellow black veteran being ordered to remove his Distinguished Service Cross struck him on multiple levels. His father, Sergeant Major William Wilson, had served in the same division as Marcus Washington in Vietnam, though in a different company. The elder Wilson had often spoken of the exceptional black soldiers who served with distinction despite the racism that permeated the military during that era. They fought 2 wars, his father had told him repeatedly throughout his childhood, one against the enemy and one against the prejudice of their own countrymen. Colonel Wilson clicked through additional articles about the courtroom incident, his jaw tightening, as he read Judge Covington's dismissive statement about no special privileges. The Distinguished Service Cross was not a privilege. It was one of the nation's highest recognitions of valor, awarded for extreme gallantry in combat. Only the Medal of Honor ranked higher. Wilson picked up his phone and called his commanding officer, Brigadier General Eleanor Martinez. "General, I'd like to request emergency personal leave." After explaining the situation, he was surprised by the general's response. "Take as much time as you need, Colonel, and this isn't just personal leave. Consider yourself a representative of this office in an unofficial capacity. We can't have civilians disrespecting military honors." Within hours, Wilson had booked a flight to Atlanta and arranged for a car to Oakwood. He wasn't the only military officer taking notice. Across military bases and veterans organizations nationwide, the incident had sparked outrage that transcended typical political divisions. A private Facebook group for Distinguished Service Cross and Navy Cross recipients, with members spanning conflicts from World War II to Afghanistan, coordinated responses. Veterans from across Georgia and neighboring states planned to attend the next hearing in uniform, many pinning their own medals to their chests in solidarity. Senior military leaders, constrained by regulations against political involvement, nevertheless found ways to signal their support. A Pentagon spokesperson, asked about the incident during an unrelated press briefing, stated, "The Department of Defense views military decorations as symbols of the highest values of our nation. These honors are bestowed by the President of the United States and represent extraordinary sacrifice in service to our country." The carefully worded statement stopped short of directly criticizing Judge Covington, but made the military's position clear. Judge Covington, meanwhile, dismissed the gathering storm. During a private lunch with court colleagues, he complained about military entitlement and social media mobs. "I've been on this bench for 22 years, he told a fellow judge who suggested he might want to issue an apology. "I'm not about to let my courtroom be turned into a circus because some old man wants to wear his jewelry." The comment was overheard by a courthouse employee who anonymously shared it with Aisha Johnson. Her subsequent article further inflamed public sentiment against the judge. Marcus Washington, still processing the unexpected attention, received a phone call from a number he didn't recognize. "Mr. Washington, this is Colonel James Wilson, United States Army Judge Advocate General's Corps. I'll be in Oakwood tomorrow, and would be honored to meet with you, sir." Marcus was stunned by the formal respect in the colonel's voice. "That's very kind, Colonel, but I'm not looking to make this situation any bigger than it already is." Wilson's response was measured. "I understand, sir, but this isn't just about you or Judge Covington anymore. This is about respect for the honors that represent the highest values of our military and our nation. I'd still appreciate the opportunity to meet with you, even if just to pay my respects." Marcus agreed, and the following afternoon, Colonel Wilson arrived at the Washington home in full dress uniform. Elaine welcomed him warmly, offering sweet tea and homemade cookies as she showed him to the living room where Marcus waited. The two men studied each other for a moment before Wilson extended his hand. "Mr. Washington, it's a genuine honor. My father served in the 101st, just like you, different company, but he always spoke highly of the men he served with." Marcus gestured for Wilson to sit. "Your father was William Wilson, Sergeant Major." Wilson's eyebrows rose in surprise. "Yes, sir. You knew him?" Marcus nodded, a distant memory surfacing. "Not well, but we crossed paths a few times. He was a good man, fair to everyone regardless of color. That was rare back then." The conversation flowed easily as they discovered connections through military service across generations. Wilson shared stories of his own experiences with racism in the modern military, less overt, but still present. "Things have improved," he acknowledged, "but we still have work to do." Eventually, the conversation turned to the courthouse incident. "I'm not here to pressure you, Mr. Washington," Wilson assured him, "but I want you to know that the military community stands with you. What that judge did was wrong on multiple levels." Marcus sighed heavily. "I never wanted to be at the center of something like this. I just wanted to tell the truth about what I saw, to help that young man get justice." Wilson leaned forward. "Sometimes standing for truth means becoming a symbol, even when we don't choose it." He hesitated before continuing. "I'll be attending the hearing tomorrow, sir, in uniform, and I won't be alone." Marcus studied the younger officer. "You understand this isn't just about the medal, don't you? If I'd been white, the judge would never have asked me to remove it." Wilson nodded solemnly. "Yes, sir, I do understand. The intersections of race and service have always been complicated in America. We serve a country that hasn't always served us equally in return." That evening, as Marcus polished his Distinguished Service Cross once more, Andre sat beside him, on the couch, watching the careful movements of his grandfather's hands. "Are you scared, Grandpa?" the teenager asked quietly. Marcus considered the question. "Not scared exactly, but I never sought the spotlight. Even when they gave me this medal, the ceremony was quick, almost hidden away. Now all these cameras and reporters, it's not what I'm used to." Andre's expression was thoughtful. "I've been thinking about enlisting after graduation, but seeing how they treated you, after everything you did for this country." Marcus placed a hand on his grandson's shoulder. "Don't make decisions based on how others behave, son. Make them based on who you want to be. I served because I believed in what America could be, even when it fell short of those ideals." Across town, local officials nervously prepared for the next day's hearing. The sheriff's department coordinated with state police to manage the crowds expected to gather. Court security implemented screening procedures usually reserved for high-profile criminal trials. The mayor, concerned about the national spotlight suddenly shining on Oakwood, issued a statement affirming the town's commitment to treating all citizens with respect, while carefully avoiding direct criticism of Judge Covington. Judge Covington himself remained isolated in his chambers, refusing to meet with court administrators who urged him to recuse himself from the case. "This is my courtroom," he insisted, when the chief court administrator suggested that stepping aside might be the wisest course. "I won't be bullied by the media or social justice warriors." He failed to recognize that this was no longer about his authority within his courtroom, but about a fundamental clash of values playing out on a national stage, with himself cast in the role of antagonist against a decorated war hero. As night fell over Oakwood, Marcus stood on his front porch looking up at the stars that reminded him of nights in Vietnam, when the sky above the jungle canopy had offered rare moments of peace amid chaos. Tomorrow, he would again put on his best suit, pin his Distinguished Service Cross to his chest, and walk into that courthouse with the same courage that had carried him through enemy fire. This time, however, he wouldn't be standing alone. This time, the military community had rallied to ensure that the honor he had earned with his blood would be respected, regardless of the color of his skin. As he turned to go inside, Marcus noticed several news vans parked discreetly down the street, a reminder that tomorrow's confrontation would unfold before a national audience. He said a silent prayer, not for himself, but for young Jamal Williams, whose future still hung in the balance amid the larger drama unfolding around him. Marcus hadn't sought to become a symbol in America's ongoing struggle with racism, but if that was the role he was called to play, he would face it with the same quiet dignity that had defined his life. Dawn broke over Oakwood with the courthouse square already filling with people, despite the early hour. Veterans in uniforms spanning decades of American military service formed a disciplined line along the sidewalk, many wearing medals and ribbons that told stories of courage in conflicts from World War II to Afghanistan. Local police had cordoned off the area, creating pathways for court personnel and case participants to enter the building. Media trucks with satellite uplinks lined the adjacent streets, their crews preparing for live broadcasts to millions of Americans who had become invested in the unfolding drama. Inside the courthouse, Judge Covington arrived through a private entrance, avoiding the crowds gathering outside. His clerk, Jessica Matthews, waited nervously in his chambers with a stack of messages and news clippings. "Judge, the Chief Justice of the State Supreme Court called personally. He's concerned about how this situation is being handled." Covington waved dismissively as he donned his robes. "Politics. They're all worried about optics instead of judicial independence. I won't be dictated to by a mob." Jessica hesitated. "Sir, there's something else. Colonel James Wilson from the Pentagon's JAG Corps is here. He's requested to address the court as an expert on military decorations." Covington's face flushed. "Absolutely not. This is a civil proceeding about a car accident. Military protocol has no relevance." Meanwhile, Marcus Washington and his family arrived at the courthouse's main entrance, immediately surrounded by supportive veterans who formed a respectful honor corridor. Marcus walked slowly, nodding to the men and women who saluted him, his Distinguished Service Cross gleaming on his chest. Elaine held his arm, her face a mixture of pride and concern. Andre and his parents followed close behind, the teenager filming the historic moment on his phone. Colonel Wilson, resplendent in his full-dress uniform with rows of ribbons and decorations across his chest, met them at the courthouse doors. "Mr. Washington," he said, extending his hand, "it's an honor to stand with you today." The two Blacktace, military men generations apart but connected by service and shared experience, entered the courthouse together, photographers capturing the moment for front pages across the country. Inside Courtroom 3, the usual orderly rows had given way to a packed gallery. The Williams family and their attorney, Thomas Reynolds, sat at the defense table, while Richard Bennington and his lawyer looked uncomfortable at the plaintiffs' table, suddenly aware that they had become supporting characters in a much larger drama. The court officer called for all to rise as Judge Covington entered, his face impassive despite the unprecedented scene before him. The gallery rose as one, the veterans present standing at attention out of military habit rather than judicial respect. Covington surveyed the packed courtroom, his eyes narrowing at the uniforms and medals scattered throughout the gallery. With a sharp rap of his gavel, he called the court to order. "We're here to continue the case of Bennington versus Williams. Let me be clear that this court will maintain proper decorum despite the circus atmosphere that certain parties have encouraged." Reynolds stood immediately. "Your Honor, the defense recalls Marcus Washington to the stand." A murmur ran through the courtroom as Marcus made his way forward, his Distinguished Service Cross prominent on his chest. As he reached the witness stand and prepared to be sworn in, Judge Covington leaned forward. "Mr. Washington, I see you have again chosen to disregard my instruction regarding appropriate courtroom attire. I will ask you once more to remove that medal before testifying." The courtroom fell silent. Marcus stood tall, his voice clear and respectful but unwavering. "Your Honor, this Distinguished Service Cross was presented to me by the President of the United States for actions in combat. It represents the highest values of service and sacrifice. With all due respect, I cannot remove it." Covington's face darkened. "Mr. Washington, this is not a military proceeding. Your previous service, while commendable, has no bearing on your testimony here today. Remove the medal, or I will find you in contempt of court." Reynolds jumped to his feet. "Your Honor, there is no legal basis for this request. No rule of court procedure prohibits a witness from wearing a legitimate military decoration." Covington's gavel crashed down. Counselor, I determine what is appropriate in my courtroom. Mr. Washington, this is your final warning. It was at this moment that Colonel Wilson rose from his seat in the gallery, his uniform commanding immediate attention. Your Honor, if I may address the court on this matter. Covington's attention snapped to the uniformed officer. You have no standing in these proceedings, Colonel. Please be seated, or you will be removed. Wilson remained standing, his military bearing unmistakable. Sir, as an officer of the Judge Advocate General's Corps, with expertise in military law and protocol, I would like to provide relevant information regarding the Distinguished Service Cross and its significance. Covington pointed his gavel at Wilson. Bailiff, remove this man from my courtroom. The bailiff, a veteran himself, hesitated visibly, looking between the judge and the colonel. It was in this moment of tension that Wilson spoke again, his voice carrying the authority of his rank and position. The Distinguished Service Cross represents extraordinary heroism in combat, awarded for valor second only to the Medal of Honor. It is bestowed by the President in the name of Congress. Under military protocol and federal recognition, recipients are entitled to wear this decoration at all official functions. Federal courts have consistently recognized this right, Your Honor. Around the courtroom, other veterans in the gallery began to stand, creating a visual display of solidarity that could not be ignored. Covington's face contorted with anger. This is contempt. All of you are in contempt. Bailiff, clear this courtroom immediately. The bailiff took a single step forward before stopping, the conflict evident on his face. Throughout the gallery, phones recorded the unfolding scene, streaming to social media platforms where hundreds of thousands of viewers watched in real time. Covington, realizing he was losing control of his courtroom, pointed directly at Marcus. You! This is your doing. You've turned a simple matter of courtroom procedure into a spectacle. This is exactly why your kind can't be trusted to respect the law. The racial undertone of the statement sent shockwaves through the courtroom. Reynolds was immediately on his feet. Your Honor, I move for an immediate mistrial and will be filing a formal complaint with the Judicial Conduct Commission for that remark. The court reporter's fingers froze momentarily over her machine before continuing to record every word. Covington, realizing too late what he had revealed in his anger, attempted to backtrack. I was referring to veterans who think their service places them above court procedures, not... But the damage was done. Colonel Wilson's voice cut through the chaos, calm but resonant with authority. Your Honor, I believe the court record will reflect exactly what you meant by your kind. As an officer sworn to uphold the Constitution, against all enemies, foreign and domestic, I cannot stand silently, while the dignity of a decorated combat veteran is assaulted based on the color of his skin rather than the content of his character. The courtroom erupted in a mixture of applause and shocked murmurs. Covington slammed his gavel repeatedly, the sound lost in the commotion. This court is in recess. Bailiff, clear the room. But the bailiff now stood at parade rest, his eyes fixed on a point above the judge's head, a clear if silent refusal to follow the order. Court security officers at the doors looked to their supervisors for guidance, receiving only confused shrugs in return. No one moved to clear the room. Marcus Washington remained standing at the witness stand, his dignity intact despite the chaos swirling around him. His eyes met Judge Covington's, not with anger or triumph, but with the steady gaze of a man who had faced far worse than an angry judge and refused to be diminished. Covington, realizing he had lost not just control of his courtroom, but his carefully maintained facade of impartiality, gathered his robes and retreated through the door to his chambers, leaving the stunned courtroom in disarray. The court clerk, unsure how to proceed without the judge, finally announced, "The court is in recess until further notice." As the gallery buzzed with conversation, Colonel Wilson approached Marcus at the witness stand. "Mr. Washington, I believe your testimony should still be recorded for the official record, even if Judge Covington isn't present to hear it." The court reporter nodded in agreement, her fingers poised over her machine. Reynolds quickly joined them. "She's right, let's get your statement on record while we have the opportunity." And so, while the judge hid in his chambers, Marcus Washington finally gave his testimony about the car accident, describing with military precision how Richard Bennington had been texting while driving, how he had run the red light, and how a young Jamal Williams had been unable to avoid the collision despite his best efforts. His words, captured by the court reporter and dozens of camera phones, would ensure that regardless of Judge Covington's future actions, the truth would be preserved for justice to prevail. Outside, the crowd had grown as news of the confrontation spread. Veterans who had never met Marcus Washington stood shoulder to shoulder with civil rights activists, united in their demand for respect and fair treatment. The courthouse, long a symbol of a justice system that had often failed Black Americans, now became the backdrop for an unprecedented moment of solidarity that transcended race, politics, and generation, all centered around a quiet man who had simply refused to deny the honor he had earned in service to his country. The immediate aftermath of Judge Covington's outburst transformed the Oakwood County Courthouse into a scene of unprecedented chaos and historical significance. Court administrators huddled in emergency conference, while reporters broadcast live updates from the corridors. Marcus Washington, having finally provided his testimony to the court reporter with Thomas Reynolds and Colonel Wilson ensuring proper procedure was followed despite the judge's absence, emerged from the courtroom to thunderous applause from the crowd gathered in the hallway. The court clerk, Jessica Matthews, a 20-year veteran of the judicial system who had never witnessed such a breakdown of protocol, officially adjourned proceedings until further notice. In light of the unusual circumstances, she announced, with remarkable composure, all cases on today's docket will be rescheduled. Notifications will be sent to all parties. Behind the scenes, the chief judge of the circuit was already on the phone with the state's Judicial Qualifications Commission, the body responsible for investigating misconduct by judges. This has gone beyond a simple matter of courtroom management, he explained to the commission chair. Covington's comments have raised serious questions about racial bias that cannot be ignored. While Marcus returned home with his family, attempting to process the day's events, the media frenzy reached national proportions. Every major network led their evening broadcasts with footage from the courtroom confrontation, legal experts debating the implications, while military commentators explained the significance of the Distinguished Service Cross to viewers unfamiliar with military honors. Colonel Wilson, acting with the precision and strategy that had marked his military career, filed formal complaints with multiple authorities before returning to his hotel. His complaints cited specific canons of judicial conduct that Covington had potentially violated, including those requiring judges to perform all duties of judicial office fairly and impartially, and to avoid both impropriety and the appearance of impropriety. The colonel's JAG training served him well in crafting documents that would be difficult for oversight authorities to dismiss or downplay. Judge Covington, meanwhile, remained sequestered in his chambers for hours after the confrontation, refusing to speak with court administrators or respond to the growing number of media inquiries. When he finally emerged through a private exit, he ignored shouted questions from waiting reporters, his face set in a mask of defiance as he climbed into his Mercedes and drove away. His refusal to comment only fueled speculation about his motivations and future actions. The courthouse confrontation had barely concluded when Aisha Johnson published a detailed analysis of Covington's judicial record, having spent days combing through court archives and interviewing former defendants. Her investigative piece revealed disturbing patterns. Black defendants in Covington's courtroom received sentences averaging 32% longer than whites for identical offenses. Motions filed by black attorneys were denied at nearly twice the rate of those submitted by white lawyers, and civil cases with black plaintiffs were dismissed before trial significantly more often than those with white plaintiffs. These statistics, previously buried in court records and unexamined by oversight committees, now became impossible to ignore as they circulated widely online and in print. The story grew darker the following day, when Johnson uncovered sealed records from early in Covington's career, showing that he had been privately reprimanded twice for making racially insensitive comments during proceedings, incidents that had been carefully kept from public view by a system designed to protect judicial reputations. Do you believe judges with a history of racial bias should be allowed to continue serving on the bench, or should they be immediately removed? Comment number 1. If you think Judge Covington deserves a second chance after sensitivity training. Number 2. If you believe his actions show he's fundamentally unfit to serve. Like this video if you agree that our justice system needs greater transparency and accountability, and subscribe to see how this explosive case continues to unfold. Former defendants from Covington's courtroom, emboldened by the public scrutiny, began coming forward with their own stories of perceived bias and unfair treatment. James Thornton, a black business owner who had lost a contractual dispute in Covington's court, despite seemingly solid evidence, told reporters, "Watching that video of him showing his true colors, suddenly the way he treated me makes perfect sense. He never saw me as equal under the law." These testimonials created a damning portrait of a judge who had allowed racial prejudice to influence his administration of justice for decades, hidden behind the considerable power and discretion afforded to the judiciary. As public outrage intensified, Marcus Washington began receiving death threats from white supremacist groups who viewed him as a threat to the racial hierarchy they sought to maintain. Anonymous callers left menacing messages on his home answering machine. Hate-filled letters arrived in his mailbox. A brick with a racial slur painted on it was thrown through his living room window in the middle of the night. Local police, recognizing the seriousness of the situation, assigned officers to provide 24-hour protection to the Washington home. "We take these threats very seriously," Police Chief Robert Martinez told reporters at a hastily arranged press conference. "Mr. Washington is a decorated veteran and respected member of our community. Anyone attempting to harm him or his family will be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law." The Oakwood community responded to the threats with an outpouring of support that transcended racial lines. Neighbors organized a rotating watch schedule to supplement police protection. Local businesses donated security cameras and improved lighting for the Washington property. Veterans groups established their own protective presence, with former military personnel volunteering to stand guard. What had begun as one man's quiet stand for dignity had evolved into a community's collective defense of shared values against hatred and intimidation. 3 days after the courthouse confrontation, the Judicial Qualifications Commission announced an emergency session to review Judge Covington's conduct. Simultaneously, the Chief Judge of the Circuit issued an administrative order temporarily reassigning all of Covington's cases to other judges pending the Commission's findings. "The integrity of our judicial system requires that all persons appearing in our courts have confidence in the impartiality of the tribunal," the order stated. "Recent events have created a situation where such confidence may be compromised." Legal experts appearing on news programs explained the significance of these rapid developments. "Judicial misconduct proceedings typically move at a glacial pace," noted Professor Eleanor Smythe of Emory Law School on CNN. "The speed with which authorities are acting suggests they recognize the severity of Judge Covington's behavior and its potential impact on public trust in the judiciary." Within a week, the Commission issued preliminary findings and an emergency suspension order, effectively removing Covington from the bench while a full investigation proceeded. The Commission's statement cited substantial evidence of conduct prejudicial to the administration of justice that brings the judicial office into disrepute. This unprecedented swift action sent shockwaves through legal circles accustomed to the judiciary closing ranks to protect its members. For Jamal Williams, the original defendant whose case had triggered the entire sequence of events, the upheaval brought unexpected justice. His case was reassigned to Judge Michael Chen, who reviewed the evidence including Marcus's now properly recorded testimony, and dismissed Bennington's lawsuit with prejudice, meaning it could not be refiled. The preponderance of evidence clearly shows that the defendant acted reasonably and cannot be held liable for damages resulting from the plaintiff's negligent actions, Judge Chen wrote in his ruling. The Williams family embraced Marcus outside the courthouse after the ruling, tears of gratitude streaming down Mrs. Williams's face. "You stood up for so much more than just my boy," she told the elderly veteran. "You stood up for all of us who've..." never been treated fairly in those courtrooms. While Marcus appreciated the justice for Jamal, he struggled with his unexpected role in a national controversy. His home phone rang constantly, despite being unlisted. Reporters camped at the end of his driveway. Speaking requests arrived from organizations across the country. Military academies asked him to address cadets about moral courage. Civil rights groups sought his endorsement for judicial reform initiatives. Politicians from both parties attempted to align themselves with his stand for dignity. "I never wanted any of this," he confided to Colonel Wilson during one of their now regular phone conversations. "I just couldn't take off that medal. Not for him. Not like that." Wilson understood perfectly. Sometimes, Mr. Washington, the most powerful statements are those we make by simply refusing to compromise our dignity, even when it would be easier to do so. As the controversy continued to unfold, Marcus found himself increasingly viewed as a symbol rather than a person, his individual identity subsumed by the larger social forces his stand had come to represent. Yet through it all he maintained the same quiet dignity that had defined his response in Covington's courtroom, neither seeking the spotlight nor shirking the responsibility that had been thrust upon him. The question that remained, as investigations into Judge Covington's conduct proceeded and calls for broader judicial reform grew louder, was whether this moment would lead to meaningful change or fade into history as another briefly inspiring but ultimately inconsequential confrontation with entrenched systems of power and prejudice. What Marcus Washington could not have anticipated was how his simple act of respectful defiance would resonate beyond the courthouse, beyond Oakwood, and beyond the immediate issues of judicial conduct and military honors, touching something fundamental about America's ongoing struggle to live up to its highest ideals for all its citizens, regardless of race. What do you think it takes for moments like this to create lasting change? Is standing up for dignity enough, or does it require systemic reform? The story continues as we explore how this confrontation affects Marcus personally, and whether Judge Covington will face true accountability for his actions. The modest ranch-style home where Marcus and Elaine Washington had spent 43 years of marriage had always been a haven of tranquility. Their children had learned to ride bikes in the driveway, neighborhood children had gathered for Elaine's famous lemonade on summer afternoons, and Marcus had tended his vegetable garden with quiet pride each spring. Now, that peace was shattered. Despite the police cruiser parked discreetly across the street and the security measures installed by concerned neighbors, the constant presence of media vehicles and the knowledge that unknown individuals had threatened harm transformed their sanctuary into a place of tension. Marcus found himself checking the locks multiple times before bed, something he had never done before. His sleep, already light from decades of combat-related hypervigilance, became more disturbed. Nightmares that had receded over the years returned with renewed intensity, blending memories of Vietnam with images of courtroom confrontations and faceless threats. Elaine noticed the changes with mounting concern. She found him one night at 3 a.m, sitting in the dark living room staring out the window at the empty street. "You need to rest, Marcus," she said softly, placing her hand on his shoulder. He covered her hand with his own but didn't turn from the window. "I keep thinking about Johnson. Remember I told you about him? The radio operator who died in my arms after we cleared that village?" Elaine nodded, though Marcus couldn't see her in the darkness. He had spoken of Johnson many times over the years, the young white soldier from Minnesota who had called for Marcus as he bled out from a sniper's bullet. "I was thinking about how he looked at me in those last moments. No color between us then. Just 2 Americans, one dying, one trying like hell to prevent it." He sighed heavily. 56 years later, and I still have to fight to be seen as equal in my own country. What was it all for, Elaine? She had no answer that could ease the weight of that question. Instead, she sat beside him in the darkness until dawn began to lighten the sky, her presence a silent affirmation of the partnership that had sustained them through decades of both personal and societal challenges. Marcus's grandson, Andre, had always been close to his grandfather, but the courthouse confrontation transformed their relationship. The 18-year-old, previously focused on basketball and typical teenage concerns, became intensely engaged with issues of racial justice and civic responsibility. He organized fellow students at Oakwood High to learn about judicial bias and civil rights history. His social media accounts, once filled with sports highlights and music videos, now featured passionate discussions of systemic racism and calls for institutional accountability. While Marcus worried about the intensity of Andre's newfound activism, he recognized in his grandson's fire a necessary complement to his own quiet dignity. "You remind me of your great-grandfather," he told Andre one evening as they sat on the porch swing. He never raised his voice, but he never backed down either. Registered to vote 3 times after they kept losing his paperwork. Walked 5 miles to the courthouse each time without complaint. Just determination. Andre absorbed this family history with new appreciation. "Is that where you get it from, Grandpa? That steel inside?" Marcus considered the question. Maybe, or maybe from knowing that dignity isn't something others can take from you unless you surrender it willingly. These conversations across generations took on new significance as Andre reconsidered his future plans. Originally uncertain about his path after graduation, he now spoke of pursuing law school with the goal of addressing systemic inequities in the justice system. "I want to make sure other Jamals don't need a hero to get basic fairness," he explained to his grandfather. Colonel James Wilson, meanwhile, had become more than just an advocate for Marcus in military circles. Despite the generation gap and their different experiences of military service, the two men developed a genuine friendship built on shared understanding of what it meant to serve a country that had not always served them equally in return. Wilson called regularly, keeping Marcus informed of developments in the judicial proceedings against Covington, while sharing stories of his own experiences with racism in the supposedly more enlightened modern military. "Different packaging. Same contents," Wilson observed during one such conversation. "The racial slurs are gone, but the assumptions remain. I still walk into Pentagon briefings and see the surprise on white faces when they realize I'm the expert they've been waiting for." Marcus received letters from black veterans across the country, many sharing similar experiences of disrespect, despite their service. A World War II veteran in his 90s wrote shakily about returning from Europe in uniform only to be denied service at a lunch counter. A Gulf War veteran described being pulled over repeatedly while driving on base. Despite his officer rank, a young woman who had served in Afghanistan detailed how her expertise was consistently questioned in ways her white counterparts never experienced. These letters affirmed for Marcus that his stand represented something far larger than one courtroom incident, becoming instead a focal point for decades of accumulated injustice. The weight of these expectations sometimes felt overwhelming. "I'm just one old man," he confided to Elaine after a particularly draining day of phone calls and visitors. "I can't fix everything that's broken in this country." Elaine, who had been his strength through combat deployments, racial discrimination, and the ordinary challenges of raising a family, squeezed his hand. "No one person can, but sometimes one person can make others believe that change is possible. That's what you're doing, Marcus, giving people hope." That hope, however, came with a cost. The threats against Marcus intensified as white supremacist groups targeted him online. One evening, a pickup truck drove past their home, the occupants shouting racial slurs and threats before speeding away. The police officer on duty pursued them, but lost their vehicle on rural back roads. The incident left Marcus shaken not for himself, but for the potential danger to Elaine and any family members who visited. Chief Martinez increased the police presence and personally visited to assure the Washingtons of his department's commitment to their safety. "This isn't just about protecting one family," he told reporters afterward. "This is about declaring that hate and intimidation have no place in our community." Despite the chief's good intentions, Marcus found himself calculating risks that had never before been part of his civilian life. He varied his routes when driving. He asked Andre not to visit alone. He purchased additional security cameras and motion sensor lights. The hypervigilance he had developed in combat, which had slowly eased over decades of peace, returned with full force, exhausting him physically and emotionally. Colonel Wilson, recognizing the toll the situation was taking, arranged for a mental health professional from the VA specializing in combat veterans to visit Marcus. Dr. Sarah Liang, herself the daughter of a Vietnam veteran, understood the complex interplay between past trauma and present stress. "What you're experiencing is a normal response to an abnormal situation," she assured Marcus during their first session. "Your brain is recognizing threats and responding with protective alertness, just as it was trained to do." These professional conversations provided Marcus with strategies to manage his stress responses while acknowledging the legitimate concerns behind them. Despite his private struggles, Marcus eventually decided to speak publicly about his experiences, recognizing that his silence was being filled by others' interpretations of his actions. Thomas Reynolds arranged a single, carefully managed interview with respected journalist Michael Frost, known for his thoughtful coverage of both military and racial issues. The resulting hour-long conversation, broadcast nationally, allowed Marcus to reclaim his narrative. He spoke with quiet eloquence about his military service, the complex patriotism of Black Americans who love their country despite its flaws, and his hopes for his grandson's generation. "I wore that medal into court because it represents the highest values of service and sacrifice," he explained. "To remove it would have been to deny not just my own service, but the service of every black soldier who has fought for freedoms they themselves were often denied." The interview humanized Marcus for millions of viewers who had previously seen only the symbolic confrontation. His thoughtful reflections on American history and personal responsibility transcended typical political divisions, earning praise from commentators across the spectrum. Letters of support flooded the local post office, many from white veterans, who recognized in Marcus's quiet dignity a reflection of the values they had served to protect. Judge Covington, meanwhile, experienced a dramatic reversal of fortune. Suspended from the bench and under investigation, he found former colleagues suddenly unavailable when he called. Invitations to social events were rescinded. His country, club membership, became a source of awkward tension rather than prestige. His wife Sandra, initially supportive of his defiance, began questioning his handling of the situation as she faced uncomfortable interactions in their social circle. Their daughter Catherine, a law student at Emory, called in tears after classmates, connected her to the now infamous judge and questioned how she could defend his actions. Covington's isolation and refusal to acknowledge wrongdoing created a growing divide within his own family. Sandra urged him to issue a public apology and seek sensitivity training, arguing that humility might salvage both his career and their social standing. Catherine suggested he reach out to civil rights organizations about educational opportunities. His son Richard, a financial analyst in Chicago, advised him to simply retire and avoid further public scrutiny. Covington rejected all these suggestions, maintaining that he had merely been upholding courtroom decorum and that the entire controversy had been manufactured by social justice warriors and activist media. His inability to recognize the racial undertones of his own actions, even in private family discussions, revealed the depth of his blindness to his own biases. 6 weeks after the courtroom confrontation, Marcus received an unexpected invitation to visit the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C., with a delegation of distinguished veterans being honored at a special ceremony. Though reluctant to leave Elaine given the ongoing security concerns, he was persuaded by both his wife and Colonel Wilson that the trip would provide a valuable respite from local pressures. "You need this, Marcus," Elaine insisted. "Go remember why that medal matters so much." In Washington, standing before the black granite wall inscribed with the names of the fallen, Marcus found himself unexpectedly overcome with emotion. He traced his fingers over the names of men from his unit who had never returned home, young men who had died beside him in a foreign land fighting for a country that had not yet fully embraced them as citizens. As he stood in silent reflection, an elderly white man in a VFW cap approached him hesitantly. "Excuse me," the man said, "but aren't you Marcus Washington, from that courtroom in Georgia?" Marcus nodded cautiously, prepared for either support or hostility. The man extended his hand. "Bill Harrington, 1st Cavalry Division, 68 to 69. "I just wanted to shake your hand, sir. What that judge did wasn't right. A man earns a medal like yours, he wears it proud, period." The simple recognition from a fellow veteran, across racial lines but united by shared service, affected Marcus deeply. Their conversation, beginning with Vietnam experiences but expanding to the challenges of civilian reintegration and the current controversy, continued for over an hour. As they finally parted, Harrington said something that would stay with Marcus long afterward. "You know, when I came home, nobody wanted to hear about the war. Now nobody wants to hear about the racism you faced. Same problem, different issue. People don't want to confront the hard truths about what we ask soldiers to do and how we treat them after." This chance encounter renewed Marcus's determination to see the judicial proceedings through to completion, not just for himself, but for all those whose dignity had been compromised by prejudice disguised as authority. As his plane touched down in Atlanta, he felt a clarity of purpose that had been obscured by weeks of stress and unwanted attention. This wasn't just about one judge or one medal or even one courtroom. This was about the fundamental promise of equal justice that had yet to be fully realized for all Americans. Marcus Washington had never sought to be an agent of change, but having been thrust into that role by circumstance and choice, he would fulfill it with the same quiet courage that had carried him through enemy fire half a century earlier. The Georgia Judicial Qualifications Commission convened in the state capital's imposing justice building, its Greek Revival architecture projecting the gravitas appropriate for proceedings that could end a judge's career. The commission, composed of 3 judges, 2 attorneys, and 2 citizen members, had expedited their investigation of Judge Richard Covington in response to the national attention and the seriousness of the allegations. Today they would hear testimony from witnesses and review evidence before determining whether to recommend sanctions, which could range from a private reprimand to permanent removal from the bench. Marcus Washington arrived early, accompanied by his family and Colonel Wilson. Thomas Reynolds, who had volunteered to represent Marcus during the proceedings, reviewed their strategy one final time in a private conference room. "The commission has already reviewed the court transcripts and video recordings," Reynolds explained. "Your testimony today should focus on your personal experience and the impact of Judge Covington's actions, both on you and on public confidence in the judicial system." Marcus nodded, his hands steady as he straightened his tie. He wore his Distinguished Service Cross again today, the medal a silent affirmation of his right to recognition of his service, regardless of the setting. The hearing room filled quickly with journalists, legal observers, and members of both military and civil rights organizations. Judge Covington arrived with his legal team, led by prominent defense attorney William Barnett, known for representing public figures in high-profile misconduct cases. Covington's demeanor was subdued compared to his courtroom outburst, but his eyes still flashed with defiance when they briefly met Marcus's across the room. The commission chair, Justice Eleanor Patel, called the proceedings to order with a sharp rap of her gavel. "These hearings are conducted to determine whether Judge Richard Covington violated the Code of Judicial Conduct through his actions in the case of Bennington versus Williams. We will hear testimony from multiple witnesses and review documentary evidence before deliberating on our recommendations." The Commission's counsel presented an overview of the investigation, methodically outlining the specific canons of judicial conduct allegedly violated. Canon 1 requires that judges uphold the integrity and independence of the judiciary. Canon 2 requires that judges avoid impropriety and the appearance of impropriety in all activities. Canon 3 requires that judges perform their duties impartially and diligently. Our investigation suggests potential violations of all 3 canons. Witnesses from multiple cases previously overseen by Covington testified about their experiences, creating a disturbing pattern of disparate treatment based on race. Professor Elijah Montgomery, a statistician from Georgia State University, presented a comprehensive analysis of Covington's sentencing records over 20 years, demonstrating statistically significant racial disparities that could not be explained by other factors. When controlling for criminal history, offense severity, and all other relevant variables, Montgomery testified, black defendants in Judge Covington's courtroom received sentences averaging 33% longer than similarly situated white defendants. This disparity exceeds the already problematic statewide average by more than double. Colonel Wilson testified about military protocols regarding decorations and honors, explaining the significance of the Distinguished Service Cross and the traditional respect accorded to recipients. "In my 26 years of military service," he stated firmly, "I have never encountered any situation where a service member was asked to remove a legitimately earned decoration in any official setting, military or civilian. Such a request would be considered deeply disrespectful to both the individual and the honor the decoration represents." When Covington's attorney attempted to challenge Wilson's expertise on civilian court procedures, the colonel responded with the precision of his JAG training. While military and civilian courts operate under different procedural rules, the underlying principles of dignity, respect, and fairness should be consistent across all American institutions of justice. No legitimate rule of courtroom decorum would be violated by the presence of a military decoration properly worn. Throughout the morning testimony, Covington sat stone-faced, occasionally whispering to his attorneys but showing no visible reaction to the mounting evidence against him. His strategy became clear when his legal team began their defense by calling character witnesses, primarily white attorneys and community leaders, who testified to Covington's fairness and professionalism. However, under cross-examination, many were forced to admit they had no knowledge of how he treated black defendants or attorneys. The commission appeared unimpressed by testimony that addressed Covington's character in general terms without engaging with the specific incidents under review. The afternoon session brought the moment everyone had been waiting for. "The commission calls Marcus Washington," Justice Patel announced. Marcus walked to the witness chair with the same dignity he had shown in Covington's courtroom, took the oath, and settled himself to face the questioning. The commission counsel led him through his military service, the circumstances under which he earned the Distinguished Service Cross, and finally to the day in Covington's courtroom. "Can you describe in your own words how you felt when Judge Covington ordered you to remove your Distinguished Service Cross?" Marcus took a moment to gather his thoughts. "I felt as if he was asking me to deny a fundamental part of who I am. That medal represents not just what I did in Vietnam, but the service of all black soldiers who fought for freedoms they sometimes couldn't fully enjoy at home. Removing it would have dishonored not just my service, but theirs as well." His testimony continued, measured and thoughtful, describing not only the courtroom incident, but the subsequent threats and disruption to his life. He spoke without bitterness or anger, only a clear-eyed assessment of how Covington's actions had affected him personally and the broader community's trust in the justice system. When a judge shows such disrespect to a witness based on race, it doesn't just harm that individual. It tells every person of color who enters that courtroom that they may not be treated with equal dignity under the law. Covington's attorney cross-examined Marcus aggressively, suggesting that he had deliberately provoked a confrontation by refusing a reasonable request from the bench. "Isn't it true, Mr. Washington, that you could have simply removed the medal temporarily, testified, and then put it back on outside the courtroom?" Marcus remained unruffled. "Sir, asking me to remove that medal is like asking me to deny my service to this country. Would you ask a judge to remove their robes because they make some people uncomfortable? Those robes and my medal both represent service and commitment to justice." The questioning grew more hostile as Barnett attempted to portray Marcus as an attention seeker who had manipulated media coverage for personal gain. "You've become quite the celebrity since this incident, haven't you, Mr. Washington? Speaking engagements, national interviews, perhaps even book deals in the works." Marcus's response was quietly devastating. "Sir, I'm a 72-year-old man who values his privacy. My home has been threatened. My family lives in fear. I've had to relive combat trauma I thought was long behind me. If you believe I wanted any of this, you understand nothing about me or why I stood my ground that day." The exchange continued, with Barnett growing visibly frustrated by his inability to provoke an emotional response from Marcus that might undermine his credibility. Finally, in apparent exasperation, Barnett asked, Do you believe Judge Covington is racist, Mr. Washington? Marcus looked directly at Covington for the first time during his testimony. I can't speak to what's in the judge's heart. I can only tell you that on that day in that courtroom, he treated me with less dignity than I deserved as an American citizen and a combat veteran. Whether that treatment stemmed from racial bias or simple arrogance is for this commission to determine. The response, notable for both its restraint and its clarity, drew murmurs of appreciation from observers. During a brief recess following Marcus's testimony, Reynolds received an unexpected message. Judge Covington wanted to testify in his own defense, against the advice of his legal team. When proceedings resumed, Covington took the stand, visibly tense but projecting confidence. Initially, his testimony seemed effective, as he explained his concerns about courtroom decorum and the potential influence of military decorations on jurors' perceptions. My courtroom has always maintained the highest standards of procedural fairness, he insisted. All witnesses must appear without external symbols or affiliations that might unduly influence the proceedings. However, the Commission counsel's cross-examination quickly exposed the inconsistencies in his position. Have you ever asked a witness to remove a religious symbol, such as a cross or yarmulke? Covington admitted he had not. Have you ever asked a police officer testifying in uniform to remove their badge or department insignia? Again, he had not. Are you aware of any written court rule or precedent that would justify requiring a witness to remove a military decoration awarded by the President of the United States? Covington became increasingly defensive as the questioning continued, his responses growing shorter and his tone more agitated. The breaking point came when the counsel displayed a chart showing the racial disparities in Covington's sentencing, decisions over 2 decades. How do you explain this pattern, Judge Covington? The judge's facade finally cracked. Those statistics are manipulated to push a political agenda. The real problem isn't the justice system, it's the culture of criminality and disrespect for authority in certain communities. When people like Washington grandstand in my courtroom, they're undermining the very rule of law that protects civilized society. A shocked silence fell over the hearing room at the naked bias revealed in his statement. Justice Patel leaned forward. Judge Covington, are you referring to black communities when you say certain communities? Covington, apparently unaware of how his words would be perceived, continued his self-destructive response. Look at the statistics on who's committing crimes. I don't create those realities. I just deal with them in my courtroom. When someone like Washington refuses a direct order from the bench, he's setting an example of defiance that encourages disrespect for the entire judicial system. The Commission counsel pressed further. So you believe Mr. Washington, a decorated combat veteran with no criminal record, who was appearing as a witness to a traffic accident he observed, was setting a bad example by declining to remove the Distinguished Service Cross awarded for his heroism in Vietnam? Covington's response veered into explicit racism that shocked even his own attorneys. He was using that medal as a shield, thinking it made him special, above the rules that apply to everyone else. That's typical of how they try to game the system, always claiming special treatment instead of simply following directions like everyone else. Barnett attempted to call for a recess, but Covington waved him off, continuing his self-immolation before the stunned commission. I've spent my career upholding standards of behavior in my courtroom. If Washington had simply shown the proper respect for judicial authority, instead of making a spectacle of himself, none of this would have happened. By the time Covington finished his testimony, the outcome of the hearing seemed all but certain. Justice Patel's expression reflected the Commission's collective dismay at witnessing a sitting judge express such explicitly biased views. The remaining witnesses seemed almost superfluous, though Colonel Wilson's final testimony about the military's emphasis on equal treatment, regardless of race, provided a powerful counterpoint to Covington's divisive perspective. In combat, we learn quickly that blood runs the same color regardless of the skin it flows beneath, Wilson stated. The military isn't perfect, but it has worked deliberately to create a meritocracy where achievement and character matter more than race or background. The values represented by the Distinguished Service Cross include moral courage in the face of adversity, exactly what Mr. Washington demonstrated in that courtroom. As the hearing concluded, Justice Patel announced that the Commission would deliberate and issue its findings within 48 hours, an unusually rapid timeline that reflected the seriousness with which they viewed the case. Marcus left the hearing room surrounded by family and supporters, his expression one of quiet relief that his part in the proceedings was complete. Regardless of the outcome, he had spoken his truth with dignity and restraint, maintaining the same values that had guided him through combat and decades of civilian life thereafter. Andre walked beside his grandfather, his young face reflecting both pride and protective concern. "You did great, Grandpa. No matter what they decide, you showed everyone what real dignity looks like." Marcus placed his arm around his grandson's shoulders, drawing strength from the knowledge that his stand for respect would shape Andre's understanding of justice and courage long after the current controversy had faded from public attention. As they walked through the Justice Building's imposing corridors, Marcus realized that regardless of the Commission's decision, a profound shift had already occurred. The courtroom confrontation had forced a public reckoning with the quiet discrimination that had persisted in courtrooms across America, hidden behind the majesty of legal procedure and the presumption of judicial impartiality. For the first time in his long life, Marcus dared to hope that his grandson might someday enter a courtroom where the color of his skin would truly matter, less than the content of his character. The Georgia Judicial Qualifications Commission issued its findings exactly 48 hours after concluding its hearings, with a unanimity and decisiveness that sent shockwaves through the legal community. The Commission recommends the immediate and permanent removal of Judge Richard Covington from the bench for conduct prejudicial to the administration of justice that brings the judicial office into disrepute, read the opening line of their 15-page decision. The document detailed multiple violations of judicial canons, supporting each finding with specific evidence from courtroom transcripts, statistical analysis, and witness testimony. Most damning were Covington's own statements during the hearing, which the Commission described as revealing a depth of racial bias incompatible with the fair and impartial administration of justice. In an unprecedented move, the Commission also recommended that the State Bar Association review all of Covington's cases involving black defendants or plaintiffs for potential misconduct, and that his judicial pension be revoked based on the egregious and sustained nature of his violations of judicial ethics. The State Supreme Court, which had final authority over judicial discipline, took only 3 days to unanimously adopt the Commission's recommendations in full. Chief Justice Moreland issued a separate concurring opinion that acknowledged the judiciary's historical reluctance to police its own. Today marks a necessary step toward ensuring that the promises of equal justice inscribed on our courthouses are not merely architectural decoration, but living principles that guide every judicial decision, he wrote. The speed and severity of these actions sent a clear message that racial bias would no longer be tolerated beneath the shield of judicial discretion. Marcus Washington received news of the decision while working in his garden, a simple activity that had always provided him peace amid life's challenges. Colonel Wilson called personally to inform him before the public announcement. "It's over, Mr. Washington. Complete removal from the bench, pension revoked, and a criminal investigation opening into his past cases." Marcus paused, trowel in hand, absorbing the magnitude of the outcome. "It's not just about Covington," he said finally. "It's about sending a message to every courthouse in this country." Wilson agreed. "This creates precedent. Other judges will think twice before allowing bias to influence their courtrooms. Other witnesses will stand firmer, knowing the system eventually worked for you." When Marcus shared the news with Elaine, her response reflected the complex emotions they both felt. "I'm glad justice was done," she said, wiping soil from his hands with a garden towel. "But I'll be even more glad when our lives get back to normal." Marcus nodded, understanding that true resolution would come not from Covington's punishment, but from the restoration of their peaceful routine, from neighborhood children again feeling welcome to cut across their yard, from being Marcus and Elaine Washington, rather than symbols in a national drama. The final chapter of the courthouse confrontation played out across multiple dimensions in the following months. Legally, the criminal investigation into Covington's past cases uncovered numerous instances where racial bias had potentially affected outcomes. The state appointed special masters to review hundreds of cases, ultimately vacating dozens of convictions and civil judgments tainted by demonstrable prejudice. For many black defendants who had served excessive sentences or lost civil cases, unfairly, the belated justice came too late to fully remedy the harms they had suffered, but it nevertheless represented an unprecedented acknowledgement of systemic failure. Socially, the conversation sparked by Marcus's stand evolved into a broader examination of how racial bias operates within American institutions, often hidden behind procedural facades and unexamined traditions. Law schools incorporated the case into their ethics curricula. Judicial training programs expanded their focus on implicit bias. Court monitoring organizations developed new metrics for evaluating judicial fairness across racial lines. Colonel Wilson, whose passionate defense of Marcus had attracted attention from military leadership, received an unexpected promotion and assignment to lead a new Pentagon initiative addressing racial equity in military justice. "We're conducting a comprehensive review of disciplinary proceedings across all branches," he explained to Marcus during one of their regular calls. "Preliminary data shows disparities we can no longer ignore." The colonel's efforts represented a tangible institutional response to the issues highlighted by the courtroom confrontation. Andre Washington, inspired by the events and his grandfather's quiet courage, made his decision official, accepting admission to Howard University's pre-law program with plans to eventually become a civil rights attorney. "I want to be part of making sure the system works the way it's supposed to," he told Marcus as they celebrated his high school graduation. "Not just for some people, but for everyone." Marcus felt profound pride mixed with lingering concern for the challenges his grandson would face. "The law is a powerful tool," he advised, "but remember that behind every case is a human being deserving of dignity, regardless of which side of the courtroom they're on." The wider community of Oakwood experienced its own reckoning with the values exposed by the confrontation. Town leaders organized community dialogues on racial reconciliation. The local bar association established a committee to monitor court proceedings for signs of bias. The police department expanded its cultural competency training. These efforts, while incomplete and sometimes uncomfortable, represented genuine attempts to address long-standing divisions that the courthouse incident had brought into sharper relief. For Judge Covington, the fall was complete and irreversible. Beyond losing his position and pension, he faced social ostracism from former colleagues and friends. His wife Sandra ultimately filed for divorce, unable to reconcile with his refusal to acknowledge the racial animus revealed in his testimony. His daughter, Catherine, changed her surname to her mother's maiden name to distance herself from the scandal. Most painfully for the former judge, the country club where he had enjoyed privileged status for decades revoked his membership following a special meeting of its board. The man who had wielded enormous power from the bench found himself stripped of both authority and social standing, living alone in a condominium after selling the family home as part of the divorce settlement. Throughout these developments, Marcus Washington received numerous invitations to speak about his experiences. After careful consideration, he accepted a single request to address a ceremony at the Pentagon honoring the contributions of black service members throughout American history. His speech, delivered with the same quiet dignity that had defined his courtroom stand, transcended the specific circumstances of his confrontation with Covington to address deeper questions of patriotism, sacrifice, and belonging. "I wore my Distinguished Service Cross into that courtroom not to seek special treatment," he told the assembled military leaders and honored guests, "but as a reminder that dignity is not granted by others, but earned through one's actions and character. When I refused to remove it, I was standing not just for myself, but for every service member who has ever felt that their sacrifice was valued less because of the color of their skin." The speech received a standing ovation and was subsequently published in major newspapers and military journals, elevating Marcus's perspective beyond the specifics of the courtroom incident to address fundamental questions about American identity and values. Perhaps the most meaningful resolution came on the following Veterans Day, when Marcus was invited to be Grand Marshal of Oakwood's annual parade. Walking slowly along Main Street, he was accompanied by veterans of all races spanning conflicts from World War II to Afghanistan. The community that had once been divided by the courthouse confrontation, now united in honoring not only military service, but the moral courage to stand for dignity in civilian life as well. As Marcus passed the courthouse, now presided over by newly appointed Judge Marion Jackson, the first black woman to serve on the county bench, he felt a sense of completion that transcended personal vindication. The week after the parade, Marcus received a letter from a young black soldier currently deployed overseas. "Sir," the letter began, "I saw the video of you refusing to remove your Distinguished Service Cross, and it gave me strength during a difficult time in my unit. Thank you for showing that standing with dignity isn't disrespectful, it's essential." Marcus carefully folded the letter and placed it in the same drawer where he kept his military commendation, understanding that his most important service might not have been in combat, but in that courtroom standing not for glory, but for the simple recognition of human dignity. On his 73rd birthday, surrounded by family, Marcus presented his Distinguished Service Cross and the pocket watch from his father to his grandson Andre. "These belong together," he explained as Andre carefully held the treasured items. "The watch represents our family's history, and the medal represents our country's promises. Both require constant care to keep working properly." In that quiet moment of generational continuity, Marcus felt a sense of peace that had eluded him since the courthouse confrontation. He had never sought to be an agent of change or a symbol of resistance. He had simply refused to compromise. His dignity when confronted with injustice, the same steadfast response that had guided him through combat, through decades of subtle and overt discrimination, and finally through a public controversy that had ultimately affirmed the values for which he had risked his life in Vietnam. As the sun set on the Washington family celebration, Marcus stepped onto the porch alone for a moment of reflection. The police protection had long since departed. The media trucks had found other stories to pursue. The threats had ceased. What remained was the knowledge that a single act of quiet defiance, born not from anger but from self-respect, had created ripples of change that would continue long after the public had forgotten his name. It wasn't a perfect resolution, he knew. America's struggles with racial justice would continue, progress often followed by setbacks in the long arc toward equality. But for one brief moment, in one courtroom in Georgia, the system had ultimately recognized what Marcus had known all along, that respect isn't a privilege to be granted or withheld based on race, but a right earned through living with dignity and courage, whether on foreign battlefields or in the everyday challenges of American life. What do you think about Judge Covington's final punishment? Was justice served, or should there have been more consequences for his actions? Comment below with your thoughts on how we can better ensure that our courts treat everyone with equal dignity and respect. If this story moved you, please like this video and subscribe to hear more powerful stories about standing up against discrimination. Share this with someone who needs to be reminded that one person's quiet dignity can create waves of change. Thank you for watching, and remember that the battle for justice requires both courage and persistence, just like Marcus Washington demonstrated. Marcus Washington's story teaches us that dignity cannot be taken away unless surrendered willingly. His refusal to remove his Distinguished Service Cross wasn't merely about a medal. It was about demanding the respect he had earned through sacrifice and service. The courtroom confrontation reveals how institutions meant to protect justice can harbor the very prejudices they should eliminate. Judge Covington's actions demonstrate how power without accountability corrupts the systems we depend on for fairness. True courage often manifests not in grand gestures, but in quiet, unwavering stands for principle. Marcus never sought the spotlight. He simply refused to compromise his self-respect when confronted with injustice. His example reminds us that meaningful change rarely comes from above. It emerges when ordinary individuals refuse to accept discrimination as inevitable. The widespread response to Marcus's stand shows how a single act of principled defiance can catalyze broader awareness and reform. Most importantly, This story illustrates that progress in civil rights isn't achieved through a single victory, but through persistent challenges to injustice across generations. As Andre carries forward his grandfather's legacy, we see how each generation builds upon the courage of those who came before, continuing the unfinished work of creating a truly just society where dignity is everyone's birthright, regardless of race. What moment in your life required you to stand up for your dignity, even when it would have been easier to comply with injustice? Has there been a time when you witnessed discrimination and wished you had spoken out? Share your experiences in the comments below. Your story might inspire others to find their own courage. If Marcus Washington's quiet dignity in the face of discrimination moved you, please hit that like button to help more people discover this powerful story. Subscribe to our channel for more inspiring accounts of ordinary people making extraordinary stands against injustice. And if you know someone who needs to be reminded that one person's refusal to surrender their dignity can change systems, please share this video with them. Thank you for joining us in remembering that justice requires both courage and persistence, sometimes across generations, before true change takes hold. Until next time, remember that respect isn't granted by others, but earned through living with dignity and courage in both extraordinary and everyday moments.